You're tuned into the Coaching Process Wins podcast.
The goal, my goal, and I think it was Coach Walsh's goal, was to do a book that was an inclusive resource for coaches. That it covered. I mean, it's a trite phrase, but it literally covered everything from A to Z with regard to what it's like to be a coach and what you need to know to be a coach.
Every day you build, you put blocks down. You guys ever see a mansion, a big, beautiful mansion? You got to build the foundation, man. That's what we're doing here. Understand that. You got to build the block.
Welcome back to the Coaching Process Wins podcast. At Coaching Process Wins, we strive to learn more about great coaching processes that are efficient, that are effective, that last, and those processes that get results. Check us out on our website at coachingprocesswins.com and always follow us for the latest and greatest on Twitter at Process to Win. That's 2 as in the number, at Process to Win. I want to paint a really clear picture to set the table for the content of this podcast. This particular subject means a lot to me because it takes me back to the early days of when I was a football coach and was trying to learn. And didn't really know about processes and didn't know a lot about what I didn't really know because it was just still in that point of trying to learn. In a bookstore, I found Finding the Winning Edge, the Bill Walsh book. Paid probably $35, $39 for it, which I thought was a fortune. More about that later. And 700 pages later, I couldn't help but becoming a better football coach from at least a knowledge standpoint. This book detailed from A to Z everything that Bill Walsh could put into one volume pertaining to being a better coach, being a better manager, being a better personnel guy. The book can apply for football coaches, basketball coaches, coaches of any sport, all the way up to business leaders, management people, corporate people. It's a visionary book. The gentleman that is giving us a lot of insight about the process of building this book is one of its authors, Dr. Jim Peterson. You'll see on the title credit or the author credits for this book, Bill Walsh, Brian Billick, and Dr. Jim Peterson. In the contents of this podcast, Dr. Peterson's going to talk about stories that really have never been shared before in the public eye about what it took to bring this book to life, why this book is no longer in circulation. It's out of print now, and good luck finding it, and I'll tell you about that more later. But Dr. Jim Peterson does a great job of what it took to bring the book to life, and I sure am glad he did. Just a little bit about Dr. Peterson before we get started. Jim, or Dr. Peterson, established and founded Coach's Choice about 18 years ago now, and it is a book publishing and video publishing company for coaches of all kinds, from badminton to baseball, but the football library in particularly is probably the largest in the world. And Coach or Dr. Peterson has been the conduit to bring people to share their knowledge of football. Heck, Gus Malzahn, when he was still a high school coach at Shiloh Christian, talking about his hurry up, no huddle, going all the way back to those days. And Dr. Peterson has a prolific list of people that share the game, and just through his way, his will, and his love for helping coaches, Coach's Choice is a great resource. So without further ado, Dr. Jim Peterson. To be called Dr. Peterson, Jim Peterson, or all the above?
Jim.
All right. How were you approached to do the project with Coach Walsh?
Well, I knew Coach Walsh because I went to Cal on a football scholarship, and he was on the staff then. But I was actually approached by Brian Billick because Brian and Coach Walsh were writing the book together, a book together, and I had published and put Brian's developing an offensive game plan book together for him, and Brian and I were friends.
So you had already done a lot of football type X's and O's and type of teaching quarterback play or offensive line play or those type of books already in your past before you began this project with Bill Walsh?
No, not really. We had done some, obviously I'm the owner of Coach's Choice, and we do football books, and I edit them, but I don't really think of myself as an X's and O's person. That would be giving me too much credit.
So Coach Billick approached you. Was Coach Walsh living here in Monterey, California at the time where Coach's Choice is located?
Well, Coach Walsh had a second home in Pacific Grove, and he actually lived up in the Menlo Park area. And I went up to see Coach Walsh.
Is that how y'all communicated in terms of you went up to see him? Did you guys talk on the phone? Did you do recordings? Did you take notes? I'm talking about specifically, you're talking about doing the book, and so what was the main way y'all communicated?
Well, we communicated in a number of ways. I saw him up there. He had an office in addition to his house up there, and I met with him several times here in Pacific Grove. But the way it came about was I went up there and met with Coach Walsh, and I asked him if I could be of help to him. And he said that he and Brian had kicked around a manuscript for several months and was looking for me to put the finishing touches on the manuscript. He referred to it as do the last 10%. So I said that I would, but I needed to see the manuscript to see what kind of touches might be appropriate. So he gave me a copy of the manuscript. I went home and I read it. I went back to Coach Walsh, and he was a very forthright guy. I said, "Do you want me to tell you what you want to hear? Do you want me to tell you my honest opinion?" He said, "Tell me your honest opinion." I said, "I don't like this manuscript that you and Brian have put together because I do not believe that it reflects the best of who you are." So then he said to me, "Well, what would you suggest?" And I said, "I would like to do a book, a one-of-a-kind book with you that on this particular topic, people would be reluctant to do another book because it had already been done about as well as it could be done." And the way it then came about was I gave him copies of several of the books I had written in my life. I said, "Do any of these meet your expectations?" And he pointed out a couple. I said, "Well, let's forget what I've done. Let's think about what we're going to do for you. Let's do a legacy book. Let's do a book that basically encompasses Bill Walsh. What you believe, what you think other people ought to know, what you want to be the takeaways for your life as a coach." And we agreed on that. And then the next step was, in the book, was I developed a suggested table of contents based upon the manuscript that he and Coach Billick had put together tentatively, and based upon my conversations with Coach Walsh over the years, and particularly on this project. And I gave him the table of contents, and he reviewed it, made changes, made suggestions, and we subsequently agreed on what the book would be about and what the topics would be and what the contents would. We basically finalized the table of contents before I wrote a single word.
Going back just a little bit on Coach Walsh, was he retired at that time completely, or was he still in the personnel office with the 49ers?
No, at that time he had retired. This was in, if I remember correctly, this was in 1996, 1997, probably 90. At the time, it was probably 1996. At that time, he was retired. Now, he went back with the 49ers, but at that time, he was retired.
Some of the books that you offered to him to maybe pattern or get some ideas about your work, were any of those books that you had written similar to this? Because I'll just add in, I'm a voracious reader of football books. I read football books way before I ever met you, and I've read so many of your books, Jim, but I've never read a book like Finding the Winning Edge as far as football and a coach and a coach's. Was there another book that you either knew about or you had written, even if it was a different subject, similar?
No, the goal, my goal, and I think it was Coach Walsh's goal, was to do a book that was an inclusive resource for coaches, that it covered. I mean, it's a trite phrase, but it literally covered everything from A to Z with regard to what it's like to be a coach and what you need to know to be a coach. Now, he threw some things in there that I probably would not have put in there, on how to deal with the media, for example, because in the 1990s, that wasn't nearly the issue that has become in the last decade or so. But he was an incredibly forward-looking person, and it wasn't much of a back and forth about what ought to go in the contents. I mean, obviously, I defer to him, and I'd say he deserves the credit for the fact that he came up with all the specific chapter topics to cover. Now, much of what we actually covered, we would go over it together, but he was the brainchild of the table of contents.
And once y'all settled on the table of contents and a general outline, in other words, the guts, the meat of each chapter, did he turn his notes over to you? Did he speak into a recorder and hand a recorder to you? Did you just go over his copious notes and piles of things like that, or how did you construct?
He would give me notes, and I would give him suggestions, and I would do research on things. It was kind of a strange book, in a certain extent. As you know, it's almost 700 pages and several dozen chapters. I wrote it backwards. I started with the last chapter and wrote forward. And the reason I did that was the first chapters were what might be considered open-ended, philosophical type things. Why? About having a philosophy and what kind of coach you want to be. And I was well aware of the fact that if I got into that, I could literally write hundreds of pages on each of those chapters. So what I did was I started in the back of the book, and I wrote forward. I wrote forward with regard to the chapters. So by the time I got around to writing the first few chapters, I wound up writing 15, 20 pages on philosophy, whereas if I'd started off, I probably would have gone off the rails and written 100, and that wouldn't have been good for Coach Walsh, and it certainly wouldn't have been good for me. He had copious input on everything. The only chapter he had two chapters actually. He didn't have a lot of input, but one he directed me in the right place. He didn't particularly care to do a whole lot of talking on the chapter about the NFL salary cap. He thought that was of interest to football coaches and fans, and that I should know as much as I could about it. And he directed me to the NFL's expert on the salary cap, who answered all my questions and couldn't have been more helpful. And the other chapter was the media chapter, and that's I enjoyed that chapter a lot because I learned how to to take a question and answer different questions and the kinds of techniques that media people do. The only thing that Coach Walsh contributed to that particular chapter was, one, he knew he wanted it in there, and two, he was a firm believer in the premise that the media sucked. And I told him that he couldn't say that in the book, but that I would research the topic and figure out how media tend to color things, shade things the way they want to, and how they engage in doublespeak when they're talking to coaches. And I think that chapter does a nice job of that.
I want to take a break here and remind you that you can always visit us and see updates and see what we're doing to talk about processes and football coaching and other walks of life at coachingprocesswins.com. As I continue with Dr. Peterson, I ask him about what I term a controversy with the book. Essentially, why is the book not in print anymore? You can't find it. You don't go to a bookstore looking. And if you find it, buy it, because so many coaches have told us over the past year or two, hey, go on Amazon and you can find the book there. It's out of print and it's rare. And believe it or not, you can get a used copy for somewhere right now around $450. Newer copies are going $500 to $1,000 a copy. So you might want to sell a kidney or trade your firstborn in for a copy of this thing. But it'll be well worth it to get your hands on Finding the Winning Edge by Bill Walsh and its author, Dr. Jim Peterson. But he goes into right now, why is the thing out of print? What happened?
Coach Walsh, I don't know how many people know this, but Coach Walsh was a regular contributor on management and leadership topics to Forbes magazine. And he had written dozens of articles for Forbes. And he, rightfully so, perceived the role of a football coach as more as an X's and O's person. So when we were doing this book, I tried to the best of my ability to discourage Coach Walsh from putting X's and O's into the book. And we wound up putting X's and O's into the book on the chapter because he wanted a chapter on the catch, the Dwight Clark catch. And I tried to explain to him that the brick and mortar part of bookstores is not a logical segment of the United States. The people who buy books for these stores neither care nor know much about football, and if he wanted to sell the book as a management book, he needed not to put X's and O's in there, because if they saw X's and O's, they were automatically going to put the book in the sports section. And in reality, if you read Coach Walsh's book and you think about what he says and how he covers things, it's really more than a football book. It's a management book, and because that's the way Coach Walsh thought. He was always 3 steps ahead of everybody, to include me, and he saw himself. He saw himself as the Renaissance man, so to speak, with regard to management and leadership. But he was very, very adamant about the fact that, in his opinion, to which was the final factor, in his opinion, we were going to put that chapter on the catch in the book. And as I explained to him, which turned out to be the truth, the minute you did that, then the book went from the management section of the bookstore to the sports section of the bookstore. Well, the sports section, surprisingly enough, is smaller than the management section in a normal situation. And what they did was they I did not publish the book. Wish I had. They published 35,000 copies. and they sold pretty much all 35,000 copies fairly early in the project. And then Coach Walsh got extremely concerned that the publishing company had not sold more than 35,000 copies. Now, I don't know why they figured on how they got to 35,000 copies. I was not involved with the selling part whatsoever. I was trying to be Coach Walsh's publishing advisor. And they got into an argument that they should have sold more because Coach Walsh's friends were all telling him this was this great book and there's no way it could only sell 35,000 copies. And I was trying to explain to Coach Walsh is 35,000 copies for a hardcover sports book pretty good. And eventually the family got the rights back to the Coach Walsh book. I'm not sure that they could reprint it without Coach Billick's and my permission, and they've never approached me or never asked me. Now, would I like to reprint it? Sure. To be honest with you, toward the end of Coach Walsh's life, by then I had already conceived in my mind what the next edition of this book was going to be, because I'd spent a lot of time thinking about what we covered, what we didn't cover, how we could have covered some subjects better, and particularly the subject of what could be included in the book that wasn't there the first time, that I think Coach Walsh was actually terrific at, and that is the subject of how to sustain being successful. On the college level, you're talking about a Nick Saban type of person. He's successful year in and year out. But that's not an accident. I mean, Coach Saban and Coach Belichick and Coach, Urban Meyer, guys like that, they're successful all the time. They're not lucky. This is a residue of a plan and design actions on their part. And Coach Walsh was pretty darn forward-looking on that topic too. We just never got around to it because he got his medical condition, and at that point, doing another edition was not on the table.
Going back into you just actually to the guts of writing it. You told me one time that I guess you were trying to meet a deadline on it, and did you seclude yourself, like holed up in a hotel room to finish this thing, or do you remember telling me that story? And
sure.
Could you elaborate?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'd worked on the book for about 4 months, and it was a fluid project because Coach Walsh kept changing his mind about different things and the emphasis and points like that. And finally reached a 10-minute agreement between he and I basically secluded myself for a month in a hotel in Champaign, Illinois, which is where I went to grad school and where the publisher was. And I finished it then, and I brought it back out to Coach Walsh. And at that point, there was a certain amount of probably interest in Coach Walsh's part to, well, let's add a few more things, let's cover a few more things. And at that point, I think I convinced him that let's finish the book, and if there are parts of the book that you'd like to revise or modify or adjust going forward, we'll do it in the second printing. And he agreed, and we did that. But I mean, when I was in Champaign, it was basically a 10, 12-hour a day thing for an entire month to finish it.
Wow.
That was before the internet. If I had the internet, I would have finished a lot earlier.
Is that because of research?
Oh yeah, the internet makes everything easier. I'd been a great writer if the internet had been around 20 years ago.
Things have changed. Did any, in terms of getting help outside of Coach Billick and Coach Walsh, did other 49ers personnel or players or other coaches in his life contribute in terms of words to you or notes to you or just anything of that ilk?
Well, not really. I mean, in all honesty, I'm sure they would have, and it probably would have been a good idea. Coach Walsh never suggested it, and he was such a wealth of information. It never occurred to me to go to somebody else and say, "What do you think about this?" No, I did get help on the forward, and I asked him whom he would like to have as the forward, and he says, "Well, call Mike Holmgren, who at the time was very, very successful coach of the Green Bay Packers." And I talked to Coach Holmgren, and I told him, "I'll write the forward if you just tell me your thoughts on Coach Walsh." And he was quite effusive in his praise of Coach Walsh. And he told me a story which I think kind of epitomizes Coach Walsh. And Holmgren was the offensive coordinator for the 49ers during part of Coach Walsh's tenure. He said one day that they were running a play in practice, and basically the play was a slant pass over the middle from Montana to Jerry Rice. And for whatever reason, if you really knew what was going on, you probably would have known that Montana threw the pass perhaps an inch off of exactly where it needed to be. Well, according to Coach Holmgren, Coach Walsh and the team spent the rest of the afternoon practicing that one play. They spent over 2 hours running that one play in practice because a future Hall of Fame quarterback threw the pass 1 inch off to a future Hall of Fame receiver, and Walsh knew that Walsh was aware of the fact that details matter when it comes to winning championships. And he just had that whole team out there, and they got that pass down. And according to Holmgren, while he was there anyway, Montana never missed that pass again.
Wow. Well, arguably, Finding the Winning Edge is the best football coaching book that's ever been written. And going off of that story of him, essentially being a perfectionist, and before people started whispering in his ear maybe that 35,000 copies were not enough, but when he saw the final manuscript that was about to go to print, was he pleased with the product? Again, before whoever said 35,000 is not enough, but was he pleased once he got the final manuscript in his hands?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think he was really pleased. Yeah, and no one knows this, and I don't think I've ever told you. I don't tell other people. Period. I don't talk about this book very much. But the original plan was the book was going to be by Coach Walsh and Coach Billick. And Coach Billick's role basically was the stimulus behind the book being written. He's the one that talked Coach Walsh into doing the book. And my name wasn't going to be on it. And when we got to the end and Coach Walsh saw it, he said, "Well, that would not be fair," which, for a personal reason, I thought that was pretty nice of him. Mm-hmm. And he says, I really want you to be the co-author." And I said, "Well, I did not get paid to write it. I wrote it as a labor of love, and it allowed me to spend quite a bit of time around one of the greatest people, let alone coaches, that ever graced this earth."
That's well said. Yeah, I've seen quotes by Bill Belichick quoting what I had just said earlier, the greatest football book ever written. Had you heard Coach Belichick say that? Have you gotten feedback from other top-notch coaches that have, said, "Hey, Finding the Winning Edge was, the book for my football life"?
Well, I think people, and Coach Walsh and I had one thing in common. He had a lot of things I didn't have. I mean, he obviously was an incredibly bright person. But we're both straightforward people, and neither one of us would prefer to say, portable earth relocation device when the word shovel would work. And that's basically the way he was. I mean, and I consider myself a pretty good writer because I've written more than 100 books, and I learned a lot about writing from him. I mean, and I hope he learned a little bit from me. One of the things I learned from him was one of his idiosyncrasies, which drove me crazy. He did not like to write in pen. He wrote in pencil. Only the Lord knows why. He did not like to write on tablets. He liked to write in the margins of those magazines they give out on airplane rides, which he took a lot of. So he'd give me his notes, and his notes would consist of his thoughts that he had written in the margins of several of these airplane magazines they hand out. So I mean that was problematic, but he was prolific. He would go on a trip and he'd come back and he'd have 2 or 3 of these airline magazines full of notes, and he'd want me to look at it. And I think one of my strengths in terms of helping Coach Walsh was I had a pretty good memory, and I could remember what he said in chapter 30. And if he contradicted it in one because he was having a non-lucid moment, I could point it out to him. So I don't think there are very many times in the book that he disagrees with himself. But he's an incredibly one-of-a-lifetime person that had, I hope, put together a book that is one of its kind. And that was our goal, was to develop a legacy book that he could be proud of, and that it would endure long after Coach Walsh wasn't here.
Well, it's definitely endured. The popularity of it, and if you had more notes to add to that second project that you talked about earlier about his, just about lasting in this coaching business, I think that would be another one that would fly off the shelves.
Well, if I ever had, I got along well with his wife. His wife who since had a stroke, was an absolute peach and a bright person. And I never met his sons. And if I ever had a chance to talk to one of his sons, I think I could probably make a pretty good case that we should do a second edition based upon his thoughts and my notes of his thoughts. But I've never had a chance to meet Coach Walsh's oldest son, Craig.
I want to take another second here and make sure that I recognize some of the things that Dr. Jim Peterson's done to contribute to football and the overall game of football through knowledge and education. Dr. Peterson established Coach's Choice about 18 years ago. He has written and authored over 100 books. Arguably, Coach's Choice has the largest library of both football books and football videos in the world. Coach's Choice through Dr. Peterson has brought some of the greatest high school football coaches, college football coaches, and NFL football coaches to the facility, and these coaches have shared the game and shared the knowledge, and Dr. Peterson has been the catalyst to bring that to the coaching community, and for that we all as coaches, anybody that's learned, anybody that's watched a video, anybody that's watched anything on the 4-3 defense that's been produced in video almost and or book, owes a debt of gratitude to Dr. Jim Peterson and Coach's Choice. So see some of their stuff at coacheschoice.com. In this last segment, I asked Dr. Peterson about NFL films, and the NFL Network that did a piece on Coach Bill Walsh, A Football Life, Bill Walsh. In the piece, they interviewed Dr. Peterson, and he talks about the book. And one of the cool things about the documentary, A Football Life, Bill Walsh, is all the people that were associated with the 49ers, your Joe Montanas, your Steve Youngs, your Ronnie Lotts, your Brian Billocks, Mike Holmgren's, etc. Each read excerpts out of the book, Finding the Winning Edge, to detail Bill Walsh in a football life. And it's just a testament to what this book's meant to so many people in the football world. So Dr. Jim Peterson, again, giving us details about that experience with NFL Films and the documentary, and then some last parting shots, parting wisdom that we can all learn from this man.
Yeah, actually, they did. They, as you could well imagine, with NFL Films, they're quite organized, and they have incredibly bright people working for them. And they called me, and they came down here, and they spent almost an entire day and talking and filming, and I gave them the story of basically how the book actually occurred versus lore or whatever else. And they did a lot of filming, and it must not have been too impressive, because then I used about a 30-second piece, but it was good. I enjoyed them. I talked to them about books in general, and this particular kind of book, and as I told them then, and I similarly told other people, I didn't get paid, but I got paid in a lot of ways, and it was my honor to do this.
Absolutely. In terms of, last question, in terms of just maybe a wish list or somebody's approached you about doing a similar book, whether it be a modern day John Wooden or Bill Parcells or a Brian Billick, or a Bill Belichick, someone out there that either living or dead, actually, that you could do a similar work with. Do you have a wish list?
Well, I'd be lying if I said I didn't. Writing's my hobby, so I actually am doing a book right now with Coach Wade Phillips, who is just an outstanding human being, and it's a different kind of book, but it's going to be quite extensive, and it's really, I hope when we finish, it'll be a legacy book for anybody wanting to know about the 3-4 defense. I had a chance to talk to Coach Billick last month, and he and I wrote a book not too long ago called Competitive Leadership, and that particular book was on competitive leadership based upon the John Wooden model, but it used his Ravens Super Bowl season as the kind of underlying theme. And in reality, Coach Billick is so bright and his understanding of competitive leadership is so comprehensive that I believe we're going to do an update of that book and make it relevant for people in any profession, and I think that'll be fun. The ultimate book to do, obviously, is Coach Belichick. I have tentatively reached out to him. I've already written his book in my mind a couple of times. I know what I would write, and if I ever have a chance to sit down and talk to him about this book, I know exactly what we could do with Coach Belichick, which would be, to a great extent, parallel the process for Coach Walsh, and I think it would parallel the end product. They both have the same kind of minds. They just think differently. The term genius was used a lot with Coach Walsh. I don't know if the word genius is the right word. I think there ought to be a word that means grand thinker. There ought to be a word that encompasses looking at something and seeing more than the average person sees. Not only how it relates to everything else that is currently going on, but how it might relate to going forward. And that's what Coach Walsh was, and I think that's what Coach Belichick is. So, if I had the honor of doing something with Coach Belichick, then you could say basically I've had the honor of doing something with two of the greatest coaches that ever took a breath. So who knows? We shall see what we shall see. I got one final story, and you can kind of plug it in whatever you want. Just
Yes,
ask
sir.
that question. But it's a good point
Absolutely.
for coaches to know about Coach Walsh. One of the things I found out about Coach Walsh that I didn't really know until we were writing this book, and I had observed because I had spent some time with Woody Hayes when I was a much younger man. Coach Walsh had a firm grasp of military history. He was interested in it. He knew it. He knew it well. And I taught at West Point for 20 years, so I kind of understand the subject a little bit. And I'm to the point now where I think I'm of the opinion that more often than not, the really good coaches understand history, particularly military history. And Walsh was incredibly keen on his understanding of what it was, how it related to football, how it related to the future of what he wanted to do. And I would venture to say I would think that Coach Walsh could have sat down with any of the history professors that I knew at West Point during my tenure there and could have had a really good discussion with him and would have more than held his own in terms of what he knew about history. And I would encourage football coaches who may, for one reason or another, not have a particularly good, strong interest in history, at least think about that as an endeavor, because Walsh was very well read, and in his main area, as is a lot of football coaches, as it turns out, is military history.
That's excellent. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, no problem.
You did a great
Let me
job.
know if you get a hold of Belichick.
It's cliche, but I hope that as you listen to this interview with Dr. Jim Peterson, you got something out of it about the process, about how greatness is built essentially through a subject matter like Finding the Winning Edge, the Bill Walsh book. Dr. Peterson has shared just frankly, some things that really never been talked about this book, and it's really meant a lot to me to hear it from him, and what a treasure this is. Again, just to give him his proper due, go see some of the other things he's done for football and other sports and motivation, etc. at coacheschoice.com. You heard Jim say there at the very end of the interview, if I talk to Coach Belichick, let him know. And anybody else out there, if you talk to him, let us know. What a great book that would be one day, and it will be one day. So I always sign off by saying, good night, Coach Belichick.